Welcome, welcome. I welcome all the members of the Tulane family and the Tulane extended family. I hope that you're all well. I know that's a colloquial expression, but has new meaning at a time like this. I hope you're safe. I hope that you and members of your family are safe and that you're exercising social distancing. Now, I know this is a challenging time for all of us, especially in the isolation that many of us are feeling at this moment. And as part of ways of combating that isolation, we're going to keep you all connected with each other and connected with Tulane University. This is part of the Tulane Plug-in series, co-sponsored by the New Orleans Book Festival. And we have a fascinating program. We have two absolute luminaries of the Tulane faculty, the Leonard Lauder Professor of History and Values, Walter Annenberg, an extraordinary biographer, as we all know, who will be interviewing John Barry, professor in Tulane School of Public Health and author, obviously, of the absolutely riveting bestseller, The Great Influenza, the story of the deadliest pandemic in history. For those of you who follow Tulane football, he was also on the staff of the great football team that won in 1973 over LSU. Now, just a quick shout out to everyone part of the Tulane community. I have been so proud about how Tulane has responded to this pandemic. There's something about the DNA of this institution which is filled with resilience and grit. 20,000 individuals are now teaching, learning, doing research, working from home, and they're doing it with incredible flair. Our healthcare workers are risking lives and have literally bent the curve in Louisiana, taking care of patients and combating this pandemic. They are truly my heroes. And the Tulane researchers are at the forefront of looking for vaccines, for treatments for this disease, truly global leaders in that regard. And all of us at Tulane are hard at work, working through how we will come back, working on ground in the fall, protecting the safety of this entire community. As part of your education during this process, the New Orleans Book Festival is providing this virtual book festival event with Walter Isaacson interviewing John Barry, the author of The Great Influenza, which really is a look at the past, but as we know, a look at the future and the present as well. It is the quintessential Tulanean masterpiece. It reflects a literary passion, but a knowledge of science, engineering, and medicine. A point of personal privilege, I have to say, one of my earliest memories was hearing my father talk about his mother's death in 1918 in the pandemic. And it was one of his first memories, going to her funeral. And he talked about what it was like those days. It led him to go to medical school and have a long-time interest in public health. This book brought new meaning to me given that history, and it makes me so proud of everything Tulane is doing to combat this pandemic. So with that, I want to turn the floor over to the co-chair of the New Orleans Book Festival, an impresario of putting this together and hard at work setting forth next year's book festival. Let me turn the virtual floor over to Cheryl Landry.
Thank you, President Fitz, and thank you so much for those wonderful remarks. And thanks to all the Tulane staff who helped us put this together through the plug-in series and partner with the New Orleans Book Festival for this presentation. Along with co-chair Walter Isaacson, we're so thrilled to partner with Tulane to host the 2020 New Orleans Book Festival. Now, although we had an interruption in our live event, we're really excited to host the 2021 festival, so I hope everybody will pay attention to that next year. And also, we're working to virtually connect with our literary community through this presentation. We're excited today to have John Barry, who was one of our original participants in the book festival, and he's going to talk today with co-chair Walter Isaacson about the great work that he's done in The Great Influenza. So we're excited to have it on, and I'll let Walter start. There's a lot to talk about. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all very much. John, if you'll unmute yourself, good to have you here. John and I, as you can tell by our fancy backgrounds, are about 5 blocks away from each other in the heart of the French Quarter. And we'll meet you all down here in the quarter as soon as the plague recedes and the earth begins to heal. I'm a huge fan of his, have these 2 books by my bed. And I want to start, John, by asking about education, because this book, The Great Influenza, is not just about the flu, it's about how education caught up with it. And especially a guy named William Henry Welch. It's sort of relevant to what we're doing at Tulane now.
Right. The American medicine well, first, I may be the only person who thinks this way, but I think everything I write about is about power. And when I approach a book, I try to write it from the perspective of people who had power to affect events. In the case of the 1918 pandemic, I wrote from the perspective of the scientific community. I certainly got into the politics, but the chief focus was on how the scientists were trying to respond, and public health officials. And as part of that background, I got into the history of American medicine, which had been through most of the 19th century the worst in the world. You could graduate from Harvard if you passed 5 out of 9 courses and failing 4 and never seeing a patient. As late as the 1870s, early 80s, at a time when Pasteur had already done magnificent things and the germ theory was out there. Nobody at Harvard or Columbia, for that matter, or many other medical schools knew how to work a microscope. William Welch went to Germany for training after graduating from med school, and also most med schools, the faculty salaries were paid by student fees entirely, so that it was easier to get into a med school than it was to get into a half-decent college. If you could pay the fee, you got in. There was very few places did you ever see a patient. Everything was a lecture course. Anyway, Welch went to Germany for training. Johns Hopkins was founded in 1876 on the German model, which was rigorous and scientific. Welch was recruited to be the first dean of the medical school, which didn't open to, I guess, 1891. And in an incredibly short span of time, largely because of his influence, but not entirely, American medicine was revolutionized. He did say at the time, even while all these terrible things were going on in medical education in the US, he did say the results were better than the system. And the system was lousy, but many dedicated physicians would go to Europe for further training. Anyway, Hopkins got rolling. Very difficult to get accepted at Hopkins. And all of a sudden, all the leading schools in the country had to compete. In a period of 20 years, really, American medical education was revolutionized, and spurred also by a report written by Abraham Flexner. So before this we got started this, we were talking about not giving long answers. So I think I violated that rule.
Yeah, it's, a nice long book too. By the way, I'm going to say I'm going to call on him later, but we have one of the great researchers in this, Jamie Cate of Berkeley University. I noticed that he's joined us. I'm going to call on him a little bit later because he's leading the effort at Berkeley and UCSF and many other places to find ways.
Let me say one more thing about Welch. He was a very interesting man. He was really an impresario.
Yeah.
And he was arguably the most important person in the history of American science, not just American medicine. He was the president of every scientific organization that he was a member of, and that went way beyond just medicine. Very close.
This virus, as far as we can tell from the 1918 flu, it probably broke out in Kansas. Tell me how it occurred.
Well, speaking of education, since the book came out, I advanced that hypothesis in the book because I thought I had located, in fact, I did locate the first report of any lethal influenza outbreak that was recorded anywhere in the world happened to be in late January in rural Kansas. And then you could trace people who went from Haskell County, Kansas, which is down in the Panhandle or near the Oklahoma and Texas borders. You could trace by name people who went from there to Camp Funston, Fort Riley, who had pneumonia in their families. And 48 hours, 72 hours after their arrival in Camp Funston, what had previously been considered the first known outbreak occurred in that Army camp. However, since the book came out, which was originally 16 years ago, there's been a lot of epidemiological research. And I think my hypothesis is still alive, but I no longer advocate it. I think it's more likely that China was the source of the pandemic. There are other hypotheses out there, including Vietnam, France. There's some very good virologists who think it started in France, and even the possibility in New York City. We will never know where it began.
And so do you think, how did it get into the human race?
Well, all influenza viruses have a natural reservoir in birds. They're essentially all bird flu, but it's one of the most rapidly mutating viruses in existence. And one thing that's unusual about influenza, most organisms have their genome is a continuous strand of either RNA or DNA. A lot of viruses are RNA. Of course, all more advanced organisms are DNA. Some viruses are DNA. But influenza has 8 separate segments that are unconnected. So if 2 influenza viruses invade the same cell, they can, just like taking 2 decks of cards and shuffling them together and then dealing out a new deck of cards, you can get a new virus with reassortment is the technical term. So in 1918, it was, of the 8 gene segments, 7 of them came straight from birds. One of them seems to have gone through a mammal. We're not sure what mammal. Then it jumped species to humans. Influenza can infect, and in 1918 did infect basically every mammal. We know it infected seals, we know it infected tigers, we know it infected dogs, we know it infected moose. Humans gave it to pigs in Iowa, and swine flu and so forth worked backwards in 1918. So that's how it jumped.
So this is during World War II, and it really spreads through some of the Army camps as well, right?
Most rapidly, yeah. It was in New York City in February for sure. That's before any known outbreak in an Army camp, and maybe slightly after the timing that I located in Kansas. So it would have happened anyway. You can't have New York City with an outbreak and not get it around the world. And it was probably elsewhere as well. But the Army camps, certainly roughly half the Army camps in the spring of 1918 had pretty severe outbreaks, but it was very mild. The virus was quite mild in the spring. How mild? In the British Grand Fleet, patrolling the coast of Europe, there were 10,413 sailors sick enough to miss duty in the middle of a war. Only 4 of them died. There were actually medical journal articles written that said this looks and smells like influenza, but not enough people are dying, so it probably isn't influenza. So anyway, the military, as hundreds of thousands of American troops went to Europe, they did seem to carry it to Europe in that spring, that relatively mild wave, which was certainly no more lethal than an ordinary influenza season.
Being in the middle of World War II, they were very leery of having pessimistic stories in the newspaper. In fact, it was against the law to have pessimistic stories. How did that allow the virus to spread?
Well, of course, that really came later. Well, you know, when there was a second wave that actually began in Switzerland in July, that was lethal. Roughly 2/3 of the deaths occurred in about a 14-week period. In Europe, the warring countries censored their press outright. The US was incrementally more subtle, but there was tremendous self-censorship. There was no Tony Fauci in 1918 because Wilson didn't want anything out there that would depress morale. You know, national public health leaders said things like, this is ordinary influenza by another name. It was called Spanish flu, even though we definitely know it didn't start in Spain. But Spain was not at war, didn't censor its press, and was writing about it. So it picked up that name. You know, you had newspapers all around the country echoing that line. You know, in outside Little Rock and Camp Pike, you have doctors saying, there's nothing here but death and desolation, rows of hospital beds, you know, in the corridors, people dying dozens a day, hundreds a day. And then 8 miles away in Little Rock, you have it saying Spanish flu, same old aches and chills, like it was nothing.
It was sort of like this virus, which is that initially a lot of people saying, oh, it's just like the flu. It's not going to be that bad. Tell me about how that played into the Philadelphia parade, in which we see it really hit that city.
Right. In Philadelphia, I did focus on, there was nationally a Liberty Loan parade scheduled for September 28th. The Army knew this was bad enough that they had already canceled the next draft, because the Army camps were already overwhelmed with sick soldiers, couldn't take any more people coming in. Medical professionals urged the cancellation of the parade in Philadelphia. There were already a lot of people dying in Philadelphia. But because this was to raise money for the war, the politicians, including the health commissioner, decided that parade would go forward. Like clockwork, 72 hours, 200,000 people crowded in the streets like Mardi Gras. And 72 hours later, the disease really exploded in Philadelphia, which turned out to be one of the hardest hit cities in the country. Going back to the question you raised a minute ago about the press, when Philadelphia finally, belatedly, closed things down, you know, schools, church services, you know, no public gatherings, etc., one of the newspapers actually said, this is not a public health measure. You have no cause for panic or alarm. I mean, how stupid did they think people were?
How similar are the effects of the Spanish flu or the flu of 1918 to COVID-19, especially when it got to the lungs?
Well, of course, it's a different virus, but the pathology is very, very similar. The way it's transmitted is essentially identical. You know, most of the people in 1918 probably died from secondary bacterial infections, which even today, fatality rate is 8% if you have bacterial pneumonia following influenza. It was obviously higher without antibiotics. But a substantial number, we don't know exactly how many. My guess would be probably upwards of a third. There died exactly the way people are dying today, from acute respiratory distress syndrome. Essentially means your immune system is throwing everything it has at the virus, and it has some very lethal weapons. And the battlefield is your lung. So the lung gets essentially wiped out while your immune system is trying to deal with the virus.
Your description made it almost feel like trench warfare in World War I.
Yeah, it was pretty brutal and ruthless. One of
I
the
have
main
a question from
Okay.
Scott Poppers up on the screen saying, why do we have second and third waves? Because you just talked about the second wave.
Well, oddly enough, I've just written an op-ed for the Times, which may run tomorrow. They told me they thought it was running tomorrow, but I haven't seen a copy edited version of the op-ed, so I guess it's not running tomorrow. You know, there are several factors go into waves. One is susceptibility of the population. Another is seasonality. Another is, you know, the mutation rate of the virus and so forth. The virus, most respiratory viruses, definitely influenza, and we think probably COVID-19, survives better in cold weather and low humidity than it does in hot weather and high humidity. So that makes, we're talking about outside the body. So that tends, plus people tend to be indoors in poor ventilation in the winter as opposed to outdoors. Obviously good ventilation if you're outdoors. So there are epidemiological reasons as well why respiratory viruses seem to be seasonal. But you can get influenza in the middle of summer, and you can get a cold in the middle of the summer. In 1918, the first wave, I said earlier, was mild. It was also very spotty. Most of the world didn't get hit at all. It's hard, probably most of the United States didn't get hit either. Western Europe did get pretty widely disseminated disease. What that meant was you had a highly susceptible population left over. The virus, I think, was learning how to more efficiently infect people. It certainly became much more virulent. Second wave actually began in the middle of the summer in July in Switzerland. That wave also ended. That was when the killing really occurred. Most of it, as I said, about 2/3 of the deaths occurred in about 14 weeks from mid or late September until December. But the last place in the world hit by that lethal second wave was Australia in January. They had delayed it there because they had a very rigid quarantine on arriving ships. It finally leaked. Remember, that's the middle of the summer in Australia. So it began in summer, it ended in summer. It was not seasonal. It hit the northern and southern hemispheres at the same time. And the reason was susceptibility. There was then a third wave. That third wave occurred later in 1919, but earlier, you know, probably began February or March and went through the spring. That wave was caused by mutation. Exposure to the first wave provided up to 89% protection against illness in the second wave. That compares to the best modern vaccine that we have ever produced, which gives 62% protection against illness. But neither the first nor the second wave exposure provided any protection against the third wave. So that's a pretty clear indication the virus, it changed, so the immune system couldn't recognize it in the third wave. So you look at where we are today, and you have the vast majority of the population is susceptible to COVID-19. So I do not, you know, the control here is going to be how we come out of lockdown. I think if left to its own devices, with probably well over 90% of the population still susceptible, you would see great activity during the summer. I do not, you know, summer will have some impact, but I think that people would be disappointed if they think it will be tamped down significantly.
I have a question here from my friend Kelly Brown, and I'm actually going to give you a quick break if Jamie Cate is still on, because it's a question he might be a specialist in. But Kelly asked about the efficacy and efficiency and specificity of the tests we're doing now. Her son is an ER doctor, and he got apparently the disease, but the tests at first didn't show it. I'm wondering if I could call on Jamie Cate, who's been leading the testing efforts with other people at Berkeley, to explain that question. Jamie, are you there?
Hi, I'm Walter. Thanks again for inviting me and John Barry for having this conversation. So there are different kinds of tests. One that actually detects the genomic part of the virus. And that one, the nucleic acid part, that one tends to be highly specific, meaning that it doesn't detect other viruses when it detects the coronavirus, but sometimes for one reason or another, it misses an infection, and the patient or the person with the disease has to be kind of actively have the disease at the time. And so that one is the one that's most commonly deployed, especially in the hospital setting. And so there can be what are called false negatives in that context. Very few false positives. So if you get a positive result, you pretty much are guaranteed you have the virus. What is happening, there's a different kind of test, but it's really only useful more or less after the fact or very late in the process of having the disease. And that's called a serological test, where you're looking for these antibodies or these parts of the immune system that have responded to the virus. And you can detect that in somebody's blood. Those tests are not very well validated at the present time. Even though the FDA is given some what are called emergency use authorizations, they're still not very well understood. And actually my colleagues at UCSF and Berkeley, UC Berkeley, have been looking at a number of these types of serological tests, and there's just a wide range of what are called false positives for these tests. And so those right now are really only useful at a population level to try to get a sense of how many people in the wider population have had this virus. You really need right now to use the ones that go after the genetic material to get a more rock solid answer of whether you've had the disease.
Thank you, Jamie, and thanks for what you all are doing to create what's called the next generation test, which will go right at the RNA using CRISPR technology and others. I've got two questions from Craig Borders for John that are really great in the book. Was there anybody back in 1918 who gave us straight talk as opposed to waffling around it? And what cities did it better than Philadelphia?
Well, there were a couple of local public health leaders. There was basically every scientist in the country was in the military, including William Welsh, who became a colonel, and his office was physically, his desk was located in the same office as the Army Surgeon General, who was one of his proteges, Gorgas. The entire, what is now Rockefeller University, was incorporated into the Army, became Army Auxiliary Laboratory number 1. There was no number 2. So these people certainly knew what they were doing, but they were not really public spokesmen. They went about their business trying to save lives in the military and to some extent the civilian community, but they were not speaking out. There were only a very couple of individual local leaders, notably in San Francisco, that told the truth. And what was you want me to go into more detail in San Francisco?
Well, I wanted to talk about what city or place did it better than Philadelphia.
The classic comparison is St. Louis. You look at St. Louis acted very early. They kept their measures in place longer than most other cities. And if you look at a graph comparing what happened in St. Louis to what happened in Philadelphia, they're radically different. St. Louis did flatten the curve quite effectively. And, it made a difference. There's another city, which I may or may not mention in the op-ed, depending on editing, San Antonio, which would be a good model for Georgia, what seems to be happening in Georgia. San Antonio was one of the very last cities to issue any closure orders. It was one of the very first, if not the first, I can't remember exactly, cities to cancel its closure orders. And it had 53.5% of its entire population got sick. 98% of every household had at least one person in it sick. Again, if anybody has any poll with Brian Kemp in Georgia, it'd be nice if somebody cited that back to them, and particularly when you remember that COVID-19 is considerably more contagious than influenza is.
To what extent did the 1918 flu end by herd immunity? To what extent was it social distancing? And to what extent was it that maybe the flu virus just kind of mutated its way off of a cliff?
Well, I don't think social distancing had any impact on ending it, nor will it today. What all that will do is provide us with some protection while we're hoping that therapeutic drugs and vaccines and so forth. And there was some good news out of Gilead today on remdesivir, if I pronounced it right. The people's immune systems became accustomed to it. The second and third time it came around, you did get some protection. And the virus itself mutates very rapidly, as I said before. And in my view, mutated, and that combination after 1920, it sort of became seasonal influenza and was the dominant virus for, if you got sick from seasonal influenza in 1940, 1950, 1955, you were getting a direct straight line descendant of the H1N1 virus from 1918.
As I look at the advice that the people gave back then, including the Surgeon General, it was pretty simple. It was wash your hands, wear a mask, don't handshake. I became somewhat surprised that it's been more than 100 years and we haven't advanced more. Did that surprise you?
Well, no, I mean, it's, what you can do is pretty limited with viruses. I guess it's a general rule that, I don't know about a rule, but generally considered about 20% of respiratory diseases are a result of hand transmission. So hand washing is not going to solve everything, but it could significantly cut down on that transmission. There's just not a lot you can do, nor is there much you could do in the hospital other than supportive care back then. Today, the supportive care is much greater if you have an ICU bed available. If you don't have an ICU bed available, you're not in great shape.
Steve Shefton here asked a question about reading your book. 1918 flu tended to hit the young pretty hard. This hits the old pretty hard. Why?
Right. Well, it's ironic. We think we were speaking earlier about how the immune system attacked the virus in the lung. The battlefield was the lung. First, roughly 2/3 of dead in 1918 were age 18 to 45. The peak age for death was 28. Well over 90% of the excess mortality was in people under 65 years old. That's a reversal of normal influenza and also, of course, a reversal of what's happening today. Right now, the immune system is involved again in acute respiratory distress syndrome, what many people are dying of. The irony is the older people, like myself, our immune systems, your immune system changes as you age and is most robust when you're younger. So older people, apparently, their immune system is not strong enough to knock out the virus entirely, whereas the younger people, they have a much better chance of doing that. But it is strong enough to launch those attacks inside the lung, what is referred to as a cytokine storm, and create that acute respiratory distress syndrome. The pathology of this disease of COVID-19 seems remarkably like 1918. You know, even to the fact that in 1918, doctors were remarking how people whose cyanosis, turning blue from lack of oxygen, was so extreme that, you know, they couldn't measure respiratory involvement in lung function the way we can today, but they were perfectly conscious and capable of talking and seemed fine, except they weren't getting any oxygen. It's very similar to what's happening today. Doctors are reporting that, you know, people are looking at their cell phones and so forth just before they're intubated. Again, the pathology seems remarkably similar.
I have a question from Stephen McCullum, who I know, and he's a doctor in Atlanta, big, you know, part of Tulane's family. In fact, Stephen, are you on? Do you want to ask the questions about Woodrow Wilson and how it affected him? Stephen, do you want to ask the question, or should I just say it for you? There's Stephen, if you'll hit your unmute button. There you are, nice picture. Hit your unmute button, the unmute in the upper right.
There you go.
Yeah. Gotcha, Stephen, ask your question. Stephen, you there? Anyway, I'll ask it unless you want to chime in, Stephen. I see you're unmuted, but I can't hear you. His question was about how Woodrow Wilson's flu residuals affected his ability to function effectively at the League of Nations, and maybe even set the stage later. What do you say about that, John?
Okay. Well, one of the, you know, in a comprehensive review of all the complications of the disease and the course of the disease throughout the world, you know, several studies in the 1920s remarked, and this is almost a quote, not quite an exact quote, that second only to the lung, there were mental disorders. It was extremely common for people to be disoriented. The people Oliver Sacks wrote about in The Awakening, it's hypothesized with good evidence that those people were victims of the 1918 pandemic. There was a disease that surfaced in the 20s called encephalitis lethargica that then disappeared. Hypothesized that was the impact of the pandemic. People were diagnosed as schizophrenics and then recovered. Normally you don't recover from schizophrenia. It was very commonly reported mental disorders. In the middle of the Paris Peace Conference, Wilson got influenza. He had 103, 104 degree temperature, violent coughing, so forth and so on. A member of the American peace delegation had just died from influenza, a younger man. And prior to his illness, he had been holding fast to the 14 points, which he said we had entered the war over. And everyone around him, and everyone who dealt with him, including the British Prime Minister Lloyd George, commented on his disorientation. When he was recovering, he went back to the peace table and he ended up caving in on basically everything to Clemenceau, the French PM, whose nickname was the Tiger. You can't say for sure that it was influenza. You can only say that he was adamant and holding fast before he got sick. There's no question he had influenza. There's no question he was disoriented, physically weak as well, and he caved in. Would that have happened anyway? It's hard to say.
Well, one of the people having written World War II, that helped set the stage for World War II, that mess up at Versailles. Michael Pickens said, why the economic impact was minimal in 1918 compared to what we're going through now?
Well, a couple of reasons. I think the main one is influenza moves much more quickly. The incubation period is roughly 1/3. The average incubation period is about 1/3 the time of COVID-19. Influenza, you're sick for a shorter period. You shed virus for a shorter period. Everything is stretched out with COVID-19. That creates a huge management problem. Also in 1918, we were in the middle of a war. The closing orders were much less extreme than what we're doing now. Basically, public gathering places were shut down, but factories continued to operate. They were all, practically all of them were considered part of the war effort. So, number one, timing. Influenza would pass through a given community in 6 to 10 weeks, and then it basically disappeared. We're already 6 weeks into closing, I think, pretty much in New Orleans, and we're just beginning to see the light of day. And it's going to continue through the summer. So that timing is very important, I think, in the relatively less economic impact. You did have a very sharp recession unrelated to the pandemic when the war ended, but it was brief. But that was, you had 4 million soldiers entering the workforce, and many of them unemployed. It created economic problems. But again, that was not related to the pandemic.
I noticed our participants here, a lot of the authors that are going to be part of BookFest, besides yourself, John, Michael Tisserand, Richard Campanella, my neighbor at Tulane's Quad, Mitch Landrieu, Katie Simpson-Smith, Rebecca Snedeker. And I might do what I do in my class, which Zoom allows you to do, is you call in from people from afar, but you also cold call on people. So I don't know if Michael Tisserand or first, are you there, Michael? There, I see him pop up. If we could unmute him, if you have a question. I follow Michael on Twitter, and I'm always amused by him. So, Michael?
Never tweeted.
Well, congratulations on that, John. Actually, I just asked a question on Twitter, Walter, which is, I just want to know what you're drinking there. I'm guessing.
No, I saw that. I promise you, drinking iced tea. And on the balcony there, we grow basil and mint and other things.
I was guessing it was a Jazz Fest Roseman tea. But the question I have for John, are there any notable exceptions of the government crackdown on the press printing negative stories, or was it primarily self-censorship by the press? And are there any notable exceptions of any crusading journalists that went against those rules?
Well, it was almost entirely self-censorship. There was a paper in Wisconsin, I've forgotten the town, that started printing the truth, and the Army launched prosecution against it for violating the Sedition Act, although they dropped it as the pandemic proceeded. The only major city that I know of where they more or less spoke the truth was really not just because of the press, but because of the local leadership. In San Francisco, the mayor, the business community leaders, labor union leaders, medical professionals, all signed a joint statement which ran in huge type and full page in the San Francisco papers. It said, "Wear a mask and save your life." Now, the mask didn't really do anything. San Francisco ended up with almost the same excess mortality as Philadelphia, both in the top 10, I think maybe both in like 5 or 6 in the country. But that was a very different message than this is ordinary influenza by another name. You have nothing to fear if ordinary precautions are taken and so forth. And San Francisco functioned much better than other cities. In Philadelphia, for example, people called publicly were appealing for volunteers to help others. They were saying people were starving to death, not because there was a lack of food, but because nobody had the courage to deliver food to these families where everybody was ill. Nothing like that happened in San Francisco. In San Francisco, when they closed schools, teachers volunteered for everything from telephone operators to ambulance drivers, which is obviously a high risk thing to volunteer for. So I think, I think the main lesson out of 1918 is to tell the truth. And when the Bush administration launched a pretty comprehensive pandemic preparedness effort, the $7 billion bill, which launched the national stockpile, invested in vaccine manufacturing technology, invested in basic research, built several large vaccine manufacturing plants and so forth. Part of that effort was planning for a pandemic. I was part of the early meetings on that where they were conceptualizing it, not when it got into detail. And I kept emphasizing in every meeting that transparency, telling the truth is the #1 lesson. Nobody ever disagreed with me. That is written into the federal pandemic plan right up front. It's written into every plan in 50 states. The problem is you still need to get someone to execute that plan. Obviously, we have not had that happen in the White House, unfortunately.
We have another of the authors. I'm going to just call cold. If you don't want to ask a question, you don't have to. But one of my favorites, Katie Simpson-Smith. You around? You got a nice picture there.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine. Katie, how are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Pretty good, pretty good.
I am baking cookies in my home right now and am wondering if there are any sort of fictional representations of the Spanish flu, either in literature or film, that you would particularly recommend to those of us who are wanting to learn a little bit more about that era.
Wow, that's a great question.
Okay. First, since Mike Tisserand asked Walter about his drink, I've got support. I support local journalism. I did.
And you're wearing a Book Fest green shirt, which I just got.
Yeah, well, Tulane shirt.
Tulane.
Yeah. It's Tulane School of Public Health.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, if I showed that, then I'd cut off the top of my head.
Better.
But to answer your question, remarkably little. I'm a great John Dos Passos fan. And Dos Passos actually got influenza on a troop ship going to Europe, which was one of the most horrific experiences you could imagine. They were essentially floating coffins. He wrote about 2 sentences about it in his entire body of work. There's a real dearth of fiction. You know, the best known work would be Catherine Ann Porter, Pale Horse, Pale Rider. She had influenza. And that's a pretty deep dive into what the experience was like. William Maxwell used to write for the New Yorker, wrote several stories about it. But by and large, there was very little. Yet it was out there in people's consciousness. For example, when the Nazis entered Berlin, Christopher Isherwood wrote Berlin Stories, from which, great movie Cabaret came. He compared it to an infectious disease, and when they did come in, he said you could feel it like influenza in the bones. So this is 15 years after the pandemic. He expected all of his readership to understand the dread that communicated, and I think they probably did. But a real dearth of literature in the English language, and I'm not literate enough to really know what was written in other languages.
Yeah, Camus' The Plague doesn't come out until the 40s, right?
Yeah.
Early 40s, yeah. Rebecca Snedeker, you want to join us in this conversation? We get some of our writers in.
Good afternoon or good evening. It's so wonderful to be with y'all. Thank you for this. I just listening to Katie and to you all, I've been thinking about, especially being at Tulane with these extraordinary faculty adapting as people are all over the country to online communications. I'm wondering if you all can speak to like what technological developments were happening in 1918 that sort of, were there any that were so remarkably like gripping society in terms of our ability to quickly adapt to new forms of communication or just new forms of technology? I saw today a beautiful choreographed video that utilized the kind of Hollywood square effect that Zoom video conference calls have in a really innovative way, and was just thinking about what's going to happen in terms of the impact on artists and cultural just freedom of expression and use of technology?
Well, I think that's a great question. I don't have a great answer to it. I don't think there was a lot of impact. I think in terms of scientific advances, there was, a tremendous boost and great advances that came out of research started in the pandemic. Much of it didn't come till later. If you get an anti-pneumococcus vaccination today, that's a straight line descendant of a vaccine developed in the middle of the pandemic. They knew how to make vaccines. They did not know what a virus was in 1918. Whether they knew there were these tiny little organisms that pass through filters, the smallest filter, they didn't know if that was just a tiny bacteria or if an entirely different kind of organism. That finding came, I think, 1925, Thomas Rivers. Pretty good argument that came out of the pandemic. The most important research finding that came out of the pandemic didn't come for 25 years. You're probably familiar with the saying that basic science, you shoot an arrow into the air and wherever it lands, you paint the target. One of my heroes in the book, Oswald Avery, he uncovered the fact that DNA carried the genetic code. He didn't publish that until 1944. It really launched the field of molecular biology. Ironically, he was being considered for the Nobel Prize before he published that paper for a lifelong contribution to immunology. That was a very controversial paper. By no means was it widely accepted. So they didn't give him the prize. I then quote 7 or 8 Nobel laureates who were real pioneers in molecular biology about how Avery opened the field to them, including Watson and Crick, who said they were looking somewhere else entirely. Everybody thought DNA was too simple to carry the genetic code. They were all looking at proteins. But after Avery's paper, Watson and Crick went straight to DNA, as did numerous other Nobel laureates. But Avery
which is good. If you look at, say, Rockefeller University, which is where Oswald Avery was, suddenly people are getting deeply serious about immunology, vaccines, figuring out what the pathogen is and how you can stop it. And you're right, there is a direct line from that to Oswald Avery's discovery that DNA was the molecule of heredity. So it created a sense that we were now going to have a biological revolution. That gets surpassed by the digital revolution and other things. But I suspect coming out of this pandemic, people, we've heard from Jamie Kate, but others are now leading a revolution in biotechnology. I know Tulane and your School of Public Health are part of that.
That's what I wanted to ask you about before we started, because I know you're very plugged into all that. Maybe you want to make some comments about it.
Well, I think that we all know the importance of science and engineering, and we all talk about—
Not all of us. Some people in the White House don't seem to get it.
Well, and you wrote a great book too about cells and other things, co-wrote a book way before this. So you come at it from a science background. And I think that the notion that we had to learn engineering and digital coding is starting to give way to the notion that we also have to know the code of life. We also have to understand the genetic code and how cells work. And it's a truly beautiful thing. That came out of the 1980 flu pandemic, was people caring about the molecular workings in a cell. And I think we're going to see that happening now. I wanted to ask you, what do you think the lasting impacts on society were, including social bonds and bonds of trust, of the 1918 flu?
That's a tough one. It's total speculation. As I said in the book, and this relates to telling the truth, I think society is based on trust, and that without trust, society begins to fray, and if it gets bad enough, begins to disintegrate. That actually happened in some communities in 1918. I quoted Victor Vaughan, who, a sober, serious scientist, had been head of the dean of the University of Michigan Med School before the war. He was a colonel, head of the communicable diseases of the Army during the war. And he wrote at the peak of the pandemic, if this continues for a few more weeks, civilization could easily disappear from the face of the earth. That's how bad things got. Unfortunately, right at that point, things started to improve. You know, you get to the 20, it's hard to separate the war itself from the pandemic. You had arguably the most pointless war in world history with huge numbers of dead. You had this pandemic, which is also killing young people. You have Wilson, had been a hero to much of the world, betraying everything. John Maynard Keynes said after the peace conference, Wilson was the greatest fraud on earth. All these contributed to the same sense of ennui, disappointment. Fitzgerald wrote, all wars fought, all gods dead, all faith and men shaken. You know, again, it's hard to separate one from the other. You have the roaring 20s where people are partying like no tomorrow. And I think all those things fitted together to separate and there certainly, I think, was a loss of trust in institutions. But again, you know, how much of that is Wilson's betrayal of the principles we went to war over? How much the lies that people knew they were being lied to in the pandemic? There was no question about that. How much it went back to the influenza? It's hard to separate the two. I do think they're connected, and I do think the pandemic was a contributor to that whole sense of pointlessness in the 20s.
Although a lot of it does come from World War I, which,
yeah,
you know,
yeah, I wouldn't want to. I mean,
modernism and literature and everything else.
Yeah,
exactly. I've got a couple of questions on the screen about Sweden, and then about Sweden versus Germany. Is Sweden making a really bad mistake, or should they, and how much better was the German model?
Well, you know, Sweden has gotten a lot of attention because of the effort. For those who don't know, they're trying to get herd immunity. Their actions are not quite as extreme as is being portrayed. For example, they are urging social distancing, just as we are. They are protecting vulnerable populations. It's not like they're telling everyone to go out, party, and get infected by the disease. They're not closing anything down, however. You know, Germany is following the Korean model, but they have, you know, it's a federal system similar to ours. Each state is making a lot of its own decisions, but as a nation, they've certainly done much better. You know, Merkel has gotten incredibly high approval ratings for her handling of the pandemic. You know, I think it remains to be seen what happens in Sweden. It's, you know, I think it's a little scary, you know, a little risk-taking there. I would probably prefer to go another route, but they are not doing what Georgia seems to be doing or is on the verge of doing. They're much more careful in what and how they're proceeding. As I say, they are urging social distancing. You know, their community, their country, seems to be complying with that. It's an interesting experiment. We will find out.
Richard, I have Richard Campanella's great books actually right in front of me because they're so good. They're what I put my computer on top of. And I see that Richard had a question or two about the great bubonic plague in New Orleans in 1914, which leads to a lot of things, including some.
Well, I'll let Richard answer the question because he knows more about it than I do.
I'm waiting for Richard to hit that unmute button. So A, he can ask the question, but also, so, you know, whether it was Edgar Degas or the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, 1914 bubonic plague, and New Orleans' handling of the 1918 flu. Richard?
Well, hi, James. I was just going to comment that the New Orleans public health community did a pretty good job with the 1914 bubonic plague. There was a rat proofing campaign that served as a template that other cities followed. So I'm just wondering, how would you assess, I don't know if you specifically studied New Orleans' response in 1918. How would you assess it?
Well, I actually did. I ended up not writing much about it. If you know, I've mentioned it only in passing.
There's about 3 or 4 sentences in the book. I was hoping for more, so thank you, Richard.
You know, remember Tulane was founded as a medical school, and largely because of and plus because of the French influence, the medical education at Tulane was probably the best in the United States for much of the 19th century until those reforms that hit in widespread way much later, because the French had started, you know, almost modern epidemiology and evidence-based medicine, really. So there was a tradition in Louisiana. Then you throw in yellow fever, and what you got was arguably the best statewide public health system in the country. Certainly, you know, one of the best, if not the best. New York City had a great municipal public health department. You know, it's just that there weren't a lot of things that you could do. The newspapers in New Orleans were behaving much like the newspapers everywhere else. They were not telling the truth. The mortality.
My old newspaper, The Item, since I was originally a States Item person, is in your book as not reporting it.
Yeah, you know, places simply, if they didn't want to outright lie, they didn't write about it. You know, there are places, you know, I mentioned one paper in North Carolina that wouldn't print death notices. In Phoenix, and I did a lot of research in Phoenix because I expected to write a lot about it. I ended up not doing so. But when the disease first hit Boston, which was the first place in the US the second wave, the lethal wave hit, you could read about it in the Phoenix newspaper. When it was in New Orleans, you could read less about it in the Phoenix newspaper. When it was in Phoenix, you couldn't read about it. It disappeared from the newspaper. They did print death notices. That was about it. It was just an effort to suffocate the news because they didn't want to write anything bad. At least they weren't lying, but lying by omission. That's another part of why people lost faith in a lot of institutions.
As we draw to a close, maybe I could draw you out a little bit on that, and then if Mike Fitz is still here, call on him, which is the Tulane School of Public Health, both the DNA of its, you know, founding and what role it should now be playing, both the School of Public Health and then, of course, the great med school and the research done there to help come out of this pandemic. And if Mike, you're still around, I'd love to hear your thoughts, and then we'll close.
Okay, well, I don't want to be a spokesperson for the School of Public Health. If Tom Leach was here, and maybe he is, maybe he could speak up. But I will say that, and obviously I love the place, it's very good to me. It was the first School of Public Health founded in the United States. I'm on an advisory committee at Hopkins, which was the second, and they claim to be the oldest, even though they were founded 2 years later. I've had many arguments with the dean at Hopkins. He says, well, you know, we're the oldest because we were continuously a separate school of public health, whereas the Tulane School was founded first and folded into the med school and then reemerged as a separate school of public health. So you've got a great tradition here. And somebody should write a book about the founder of the Tulane School because he was crazy. Well, I shouldn't have said that, but he was a really interesting character. don't ask me to go into it.
Well,
All right.
that'll be another event. We'll talk about the crazy founder, but I will say, I came to Tulane 6 years ago, and there is something about this institution, its DNA, which is very outward looking and very public focused. And it's reflected in our founding as an institution trying to solve the problems of yellow fever. And you see it today in this sort of incredible support for research and care in COVID-19. It's just sort of what the institution is about. And obviously, your work is just a wonderful illustration of sort of the history of pandemics, but also it resonates today with all of us about what we should be doing to combat this problem. So,
I do think it will not only ingrain the role of Tulane in the community, but the role of service at a university. We're seeing universities across the country switching from a model of just being pure ivory tower to being of in-service in a crisis like this. This is not something Tulane has to learn how to do. It was founded on that principle. It did it in the hurricane, and it's doing it now. I want to thank some of the, I noticed on my participants list and what they've sent me, some of the people have been really supportive of the book festival. And we'll do more of these book festival conversations. By the way, Thomas Leviste, I think I'm doing a conversation with him for Tulane on Monday. That's part of an innovation series. So if those of you want to hear that, it's not part of our book fest series, but you can send an email to whoever invited you to this, and we can probably get you on that innovation series. But as I say, I noticed that Hunter and Kathy Pearson are part of this. Jimmy and Pixie Reese, I'll give Pixie a shout out. She attended my entire class this semester on the digital revolution and even asked for the final exam on it. David Wild, Jay Kroll, Nancy Bader, Beverly Dale, and I'm sure there are a few others, but thank you all for supporting the book festival. John, thank you very much. We also have, by the way, I just noticed, Mitch Landrew. So, hey, Mitch, say a quick hello to us and tell us what you're doing. There's Mitch. Mitchell.
hit the unmute.
Hit the unmute, Mitch.
Yeah,
Yeah, there you are. Thanks for sitting in. Appreciate
no
it.
problem. That was fantastic. John, thank you so much. A voracious brain and a great memory. And Mike, you're right about that. I have vivid memories of how resilient Tulane was after Katrina. The city really would not have come back had Tulane not helped lead the way. And it's in the bones of that institution, as well as Walter said earlier, the commitment to service in the community. Tulane, as you know, is the largest employer in the city of New Orleans and always been a great anchor and a great partner. And Walter, as always, a really good interlocutor for all of these brilliant people. And I thank all of you for being a part of it. And to my beautiful wife, Cheryl, who's a co-partner in this effort. This was really a thrilling conversation, and I look forward to more of them.
Yep, and to Allison Hertzberg, Cheryl, of course, Lindsay Billups, who helped put this together, and Jenny Wise. We want to thank all of you, and stay tuned for the next email that'll tell you when we're going to be doing this again. Hey, John, let's meet around the corner pretty soon, okay?
Hey, thanks very much. And I should have said first, thanks to you and to Cheryl for doing this. I think it's great that first, the idea for the Tulane Book Fest was a magnificent idea. The city really can benefit from that over time. And for putting together this virtual book fest as well. Thanks.
Well, thank you all very much, and stay healthy, please, all of you. Bye-bye.